Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be back with you again. And today I'm more than happy to be speaking to one of my favorite journalists and analysts from Syria, Kevork Almassian. Kevork, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Vanessa. Thank you very much for having me.
It's always a pleasure talking to you and always educational and enlightening. So much has been happening in the region that it's actually very difficult to keep up with the huge geopolitical shifts that have been going on, and that in some ways are kind of materializing in Syria almost more than anywhere else.
Yes.
And since the earthquake, there has been, let's say, a very big shift towards inclusion of Syria back in the Arab communities. I almost ironically said on Twitter the other day that after all of these decades of war that the West has waged against countries in the region, either through clandestine black op operations, regime change operations and wars, to prevent any kind of Pan-Arabism, the end result appears to be Pan-Arabism. How do you, I mean, what has suddenly caused this shift? Can you describe the main elements of that shift that have
Of course.
come into place since the earthquake?
Yes. I would like just to give historical context for the listeners to understand how Pan-Arabism was effective against colonialism and how opposite forces were created to destroy Pan-Arabism in the region. First of all, I'm of an Armenian descent, so I'm not an Arab. However, I have read history and I understood from the books that I have read that when the French and the Brits, they colonized the Middle East, especially Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, and Jordan, after First World War, Pan-Arabism and socialism, both, they were the driving force against this occupation, against the mandates, so-called mandates, which were colonizing these territories. So the Brits, they had this quote unquote brilliant idea that in order to fight Pan-Arabism, they have to create an Islamist forces in the region, radicalized, and make these two forces busy fighting each other. And we can see in early 20s, these Islamist forces started to be formed in Egypt, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. And then we have seen Sayyid Qutb and his teachings. These were all directed by the British intelligence apparatuses in the region, and they helped these ideas to spread in the region in order to fight against the socialist and Pan-Arabist forces. So the peak of the Pan-Arabism was under Jamal Abdel Nasser and then Hafez al-Assad, who united. We're talking about an intellectual unity among, or let's say, cultural civilization unity among different people in the region under one umbrella, which is Pan-Arabism, that you unite these different group of people that they're not necessarily Arabs, but under this umbrella, you can unite them in order to be one force, united force against the French mandate, the British mandate, and after that, all the wars that happened after World War II, right? So this was the background. I would say Pan-Arabism started to be weakened, especially after the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser and then the death of Hafez al-Assad, and mostly because of the petrodollar. So what happened back then is a strong connection that has been established between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which linked the dollar to the sale of the petrol or the fuel around the world. And since then, because Saudi Arabia isn't really a pan-Arabic country, they have fought against Jamal Abdel Nasser in Yemen. They have fought against Hafez al-Assad at several occasions, and later against Bashar. This has happened mostly because of the presence of the American forces in the region and their intermarriage with Al Saud, the Saudis, and later with the Qataris, starting from, I would say, 2010, after the so-called of the Arab Spring. In my opinion, this is a start. This Pan-Arabism that was weakened in the past, now it started to revive a little bit. Now we can speak about 2023. And there are several reasons for that, in my opinion, one of which is the Americans are slowly but surely withdrawing from the Middle East. And I'm speaking about the number of their forces in the region, the quality of the weapons that they had in the region. Because in the past, there was the Carter Doctrine, which they had to secure the energy flow of the energy resources to the United States. And now that the United States is self-sufficient with fuel, they are extracting their own fuel, which is from the rock fuel, I believe it's called. And they're now even exporting natural liquefied gas to Europe. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan, all this participated in more periphery for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, periphery for them to, for freedom to move outside of the umbrella of the United States. And with the arrival of MBS to power in 2018, for example, he stopped the supporting of Jaish al-Islam in Damascus, and they went to Turkey, and they were embraced by Turkey. So the Saudis started to talk with Syria from 2018, and they made a shift in their policy. And this takes time because there were so many meetings between the Syrians and the Saudis on a security level, but these were all like secret meetings. And now we're seeing the fruit for these meetings in the region, that the Saudis, in my opinion, they have a vision, which is Saudi 2030 vision. They want to transform their country into or change the economic structure in their country, because they're preparing themselves for the era after the fuel, after the oil. So they have to be prepared for that. I have learned that there are so many cities are being constructed now in Saudi Arabia that they want to be a technology hub, a gaming hub, which is a crazy idea that they're hosting so many engineers to develop online games in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, so the tech sector is booming in Saudi Arabia. The UAE is they have also taken a different approach towards Syria, especially after 2018. They were the first one to open the embassies in these countries, and now we can see that the Saudis definitely found themselves in a situation that they can continue the same path, which means more wars and destruction in the region, the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, conflict in Palestine, conflict in Lebanon and other regions, or they can restore some of the stability in the region through cooperation. And we have seen this now with the talks with Assad and also talks with China. I think China and Iran. So I think the Americans were caught in surprise that the Saudis are changing this course. But it's in the interest of Saudi Arabia, because stability is essential for them to implement their economic vision, and also to nominate their country for the next World Cup. So it's in their core economic interest now to stabilize the region. So they're not stabilizing the region because they like us or they like the color of our eyes, you know, all this thing. No, they have an interest. The same applies on Turkey now, because the Russians are in a big geopolitical competition with the United States to gain Turkey, which is one of the most important countries in the region, on their side. And the Russians promised Turkey to convert or transform Turkey into an energy hub, so that there are new gas pipelines are being established now, the Turk Stream, so that Turkey can distribute this gas to the European countries later. So in order for Turkey to become an energy hub, they also have to stabilize the region. It's not possible for them, for example, to have Kurdish militias on the borders with Syria, 3 million refugees in their countries, and the burden on their economy. So they need to talk to the Syrian government, and that's why now they are rushing to solve the problems with Syria. But in my understanding of Damascus foreign policy, I think the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia is closer than the rapprochement with Turkey, because it's very more complicated with Turkey, that they have forces in Syria.
Yeah.
There is Al-Qaeda forces in Idlib that are embedded with the Turkish forces, the multinational jihadists, the refugee crisis, and the Kurdish forces on the borders with Turkey. So all these files have to be discussed one by one. And Syrians, they see that they are not in rush to speak with Erdogan, because what if he doesn't come to power again? He's not reelected.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
that's a possibility. And also, when they open up with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the rest of the world, the Arab world, they already have solved half the problem for them. So the rest for them is like, let's wait and see who is going to come to power in Ankara. But the Russians are that they are very interested in helping Erdogan in these elections. So they're asking the Syrians to meet with Erdogan before the elections and give him a diplomatic bonus before the elections, that he's the one who can solve this problem, not the opposition.
Yeah.
I don't know why the Russians do not prefer the opposition. I am not an expert in the Turkish affairs, but it's pretty obvious that the Russians all the time tell the Damascus that it's better to talk with Erdogan now before the elections. So that's now we have a meeting between the foreign ministers very soon, I believe in Moscow. And later it could be between Erdogan and Assad. But also, all the sources in Damascus assure that there will be no agreement. The Syrian side will not put its signature on any agreement unless there is a clear schedule for the withdrawal of the Turkish occupation forces from Syria. And I think that solves lots of problems, because without the Turkish forces in Syria, the so-called Free Syrian Army, the National Army, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all these groups, they would be smashed in a matter of weeks, because they will not have any reinforcement routes for them, any sort of support coming, whether it's intelligence, whether it's military or economic. Their economic lifeline is from Turkey. So if Turkey agrees with Syria, this group will demise. Let's remember what happened in Eastern Ghouta. When Saudis stopped supporting Jaish al-Islam and Donald Trump stopped the CIA-covered operation in Syria in 2017, in 1 year, they lost large swaths of territories, because their lifeline, the continuation of these groups, depends basically on foreign support and not from local support.
Yeah, absolutely. There is another player in this that I'll come on to also, which is Egypt, that has also been making approaches towards Syria recently. But there's also, I mean, what I'm kind of thinking of, okay, if some sort of agreement is reached with Erdogan, and I guess from the Russian perspective, it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And they have always, to some degree, protected Erdogan, even in the 2016 potential coup. So there's clearly some relationship there that they value for some reason. I certainly don't think that Russia and Turkey are natural allies. Neither are Russia and Israel, in my opinion. But Russia has the role of negotiator and reconciliation in the region between the states that have been hostile against Syria since 2011. But for example, I mean, you talked about the withdrawal of Turkish proxy forces and their own military from Syria. Well, their own military is relatively easy, I guess. I mean, they just have to withdraw them. But the various terrorist forces, I'm not sure of what the numbers are right now, that are under the control of Turkey. I mean, where, for example, are they going to go? Is Turkey going to simply withdraw them into Turkish territory? Or do you think they're going to try and displace them elsewhere, as they have been doing, of course, into Libya, perhaps even into Afghanistan, I think. And then you have wherever they can get rid of them, basically.
I mean, they can live, they can get along with the Taliban easily.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but this is a $1 million question, because in my opinion, the Turks, they already abandoned the political opposition. They
Mm.
ask them not to bark against the Syrian government, and they ask them not to do any political activities in Turkey. They're closing their offices. Saudi Arabia did it in 2018. The only regional country that still supports the Syrian opposition, both the political and military, actively, I would say it's Qatar.
Mm.
Turkey, they're not like they're restricting their work. They are detaining journalists.
Yes.
Who were Syrian journalists who were like, I would say, they were praising Erdogan day and night, and now they are being detained because they criticize something in the refugee policy in Turkey. So Turkey doesn't have an appetite now for the opposition. I think the most important thing here are the multinational jihadists, the
Mm.
local fighters. If they feel that they are sandwiched between
Mm.
Turkey and
Mm.
Syria, they will drop their weapons like they did in several places in Syria, and they would join the reconciliation. And you will see the same people who were on TV saying we will come in Damascus and occupy and kill Assad. They will be the first one who are praising Assad and all this. Like it happened all the time. It happens all the time in Eastern Ghouta. We've seen people actively participating in armed hostilities against the government, and then they were like, "Oh, we were mistaken, and we want to come back." Um, so we in Arabic there is a saying, "Whoever marries my mother, I call him an uncle." It's like, yeah, it's really that way. The Syrian local fighters, they will drop their arms and they will join the reconciliation, and they will be slowly assimilated in
Mm.
because the power of the Syrian government is
Mm.
now they have. Huge power after I would say militarily, that the opposition will find itself in a lost war, right?
Yeah.
The foreign fighters, this has to be done through intelligence channels.
Mhm.
I believe Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, if they communicate with their original countries, these fighters should like go to their own countries, be imprisoned in their own countries. They don't have any, I would say, future in Syria. That's for sure, 100%. Um, Speaking of Egypt, because you mentioned Egypt,
Mm.
I would like to say, like, even when the Muslim Brotherhood president Mohammed Morsi was in power and he declared jihad on Syria, if you remember, he
Yep.
gathered all these Islamists in a basketball hall and he said that you have to wage a jihad against Syria. Even then, the Egyptian army and the intelligence were in like continuous contact with the Syrian side. They
Mhm.
never stopped the contact with the Syrian side, but it's very bothering me that they were very, I would say, shy to declare these relations with the Syrian side, as if it's some sort of a sin, because geopolitically speaking, the national security of Syria is from the national security of Egypt. And that is why Arab geopolitical experts say that this is the reason why Brits, they created Israel in Palestine, which stops the connectivity, geopolitical connectivity between Egypt and Syria. If we
Mhm.
see all the empires that came to the region, none of the all the empires, they tried to conquer the coastal side of Syria and also the Sinai and the coastal side of Egypt. This was the most important geopolitical, I would say, route for them in the Middle East. And now, because there is Israel in the middle, this connectivity has been destroyed. So some would argue that this is the reason why the Brits created also Israel in Palestine. But now with Sisi, there is no reason for Egypt not to declare its relations and put it on the table. I mean, the MBS, he's contacting the Syrian side, and they would be meeting between Assad and MBS. The Emiratis are declaring it on the table. So I think the Egyptians, because they revolve in this orbit, UAE, Saudi Arabia against Qatari orbit and Qatari and Turkey, I think for them it makes sense also diplomatically and geopolitically. They understood 10 years of fighting Syria means every time they fight against Syria, Syria goes more and more into the side of Iran. And Iran will gain more influence in the region as long as Syria is being fought against by these powers, because there is an existential threat on Syria, and Syria has allies, and they are Russia and Iran. And those are the ones who were ready to come and fight with the Syrian side.
Mm-hmm.
So for Saudi Arabia and Egypt, who are also regional powers, it's better for them to balance Syria's relationships between different powers than being heavily, I would say, embedded with the Iranian policy. And I would say that that's not an unhealthy thing. People need to know that Syria was for a very long time a balancing force in the region. They are in the axis that against Israel, and for that they are in the axis with Iran and Hezbollah, and they're getting weapons from Russia. But at the same time, they're playing a mediation role between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iran and other regional countries, and they were trying to balance these relations between different regional powers. But there is an argument in Saudi Arabia that if you listen it from the Saudi side, it makes sense from the Saudi side, because the Saudis always say under Hafez al-Assad, Hafez was always balancing all the powers together, and Hafez never gave Iran a big access in Syria. But their critic for Bashar Assad is that he made very strategic relations with Iran, and he invited Turkey and Qatar to become regional powers in the Arab world. And they say, were it not for Assad's relations with Erdogan and Hamad and these leaders between 2005 and 2010, there was no role for Qatar and Turkey in the region. So one would argue that before these relations with Erdogan and Qatar, the three countries who regularly used to meet, the leader of Egypt, the leader of Syria, and the leader of Saudi Arabia, and they used to resolve all the problems in the region through negotiations. And once the Turks and the Qataris became regional powers, thanks to Syria, which opened the doors for them in the Middle East, it has become more destabilized because there are more powers seeking for more influence in the region.
Yeah.
I remember during the era of Hafez used to meet with the king of Saudi Arabia and Hosni Mubarak, and there was no conflict between them. It's like, what are the problems? And we solve it with negotiations. And even the Saudis allowed Syria to go to Lebanon during the civil war, right? And this was a Saudi permission also for the Syrians. So I truly believe that we have also to be a little bit, we have to do some self-critic. It was not right to give the Qataris and the Turks an access to the Middle East and open them the borders and allow them to do business with Syria without taxation, somehow destroying our industries in Aleppo. And the Qataris are the same. They had so close relations with all the security military apparatuses in Syria that they knew all the secrets of the country, and they're the ones who waged this war against Syria at the end.
Yeah. And also, I think currently Egypt is to a large degree vulnerable again. I mean, the country has been destroyed by successive IMF loans,
Yes.
which have spiraled the country into mass poverty. I mean, a population of, well, it used to be 90 million. I'm quite sure it's much higher than that now. And of course, there's sandwich between the kind of Mossad, CIA, MI6 operations in the Sinai that have weaponized similar terrorists that are in Syria against Egypt, so on the eastern side of the Suez, and Libya, of course, which is, has been reduced to a terrorist vacuum by the NATO member state war against Libya, which again, destroyed the country itself, or assassinated Gaddafi, who again was, whatever you thought of him, he was progressive. Libya was one of the most developed countries in Africa, and of course then was taken back to the Dark Ages, and as I said, reduced down to this criminal failed state, which is a total vacuum for terrorism. So Egypt is sandwiched between the two.
Yes.
Right. And I think it understands its own vulnerability. It sees Syria as you've said, and we can all see, as the emerging, extraordinarily, the emerging hub in the region, and it doesn't want to be left behind. Plus,
Yes.
it has its own internal Muslim Brotherhood problem, right? So I think Egypt is also very much on a self-interest mission here, in the sense that it recognizes that the stability is going to come from the new axis of China, Russia, and the countries that are aligning itself with the non-aligned axis, and not with, as it has been traditionally, with the US, the UK, and even under Sisi with Israel to
Yes.
some degree, right? So I think what we're seeing is this incredible kind of realignment. But you mentioned Qatar. And what I find really fascinating is how quiet Qatar has been with, with all of these changes. And in reality, what has it done? It's come down on the side of the West very strongly in the
Yes.
northwest and Idlib. It is picking up the funding for the previously discredited organization, MI6 and CIA organization, the White Helmets.
Yeah.
Qatar is now coming forward as really one of the primary sponsors of the White Helmet. So it's making its position very clear. It's basically appearing to say, while all of these other countries are recognizing that they have to be more inclusive towards Syria and that they have to bring peace to the region, Qatar is almost going against the stream, right?
Yes. I would say Qatar is the only country now that supports the opposition, armed and political. They have made it clear, even in statements and in their also Al Jazeera coverage, that they are against this reconciliation with the Syrian government. However, we have to know, if Syria strikes a deal with Turkey, Qatar will lose its leverage in Syria, because they will not have geographical access in Syria. The Qataris are operating from Turkey in Syria. The funding, the weapons, and intelligence support that comes, it comes from Turkey. So if the Turks close the borders with Syria, or for these militants, the Qataris will not have an access in Syria. The only weapon they will continue to have is Al Jazeera. And they can bark as much as they want by Al Jazeera. If there is no actual support, tangible support on the ground for these militants, they will just be absorbed by the Syrian government. And I think if the Syrian government at the moment, they have the Russians told them something when Assad visited in Moscow. The Russians told them there is no need to urge, to ask, to demand the Western governments to lift the sanctions. Just don't waste your energy. First, they're not going to listen. And secondly, we are creating a parallel financial system. We're creating a multipolar world. You don't need them. Our natural resources, our financial power, it will accumulate, and we will become strong enough to help Syria to overcome. You can open channels with Europe if you want, because you're close to Europe, but don't expect them to lift the sanctions and open ties with you. So it's better to, and I think Syria already has taken this decision. I think this was the last time they would trust the Europeans. Regardless who is in power, this was the last time I think they would give them any investment or any privileges in Syria. They could be normal diplomatic relations in the future, but they will not be, for example, Syria was participating in this Syrian European Association Agreement. The last moment the Syrians withdrew from it. The Syrians were trying to have better relations with Europe than with Russia. And I remember in 2012, Lavrov was in a meeting with European foreign ministers, and the European foreign ministers told Lavrov, in a sense, that tell your partner or your ally, like, to do some reforms, blah, blah, blah. And Lavrov told the European ministers, what are you talking about? Assad visited European countries and tried to make deals with you more than he visited Moscow. He visited Moscow only twice since he came to power in 10 years. But he visited more than probably 5-6 times to different European countries, right? So I think that's the last time the Syrians would trust Europeans, unfortunately, especially now after the Ukraine war. Everything is clear, the polarization is very clear, and you have to stand where you should stand at the moment, and it's not on the side of the Europeans. With the BRICS Bank is being now developed, and with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is being empowered. I think Syria's future is with the East, with China, Russia, India, even Pakistan, and the rest of the countries who are willing to cooperate with Syria. And the Europeans are already irrelevant now. They cannot even now manage their own foreign policy. They don't have a foreign policy. It's so ridiculous how they lowered their standards, and they have become like, you cannot even differentiate what's the foreign policy of the European Union compared to the American foreign policy.
Exactly.
Like, what's the purpose now of the European Union if it's the same policy of Washington? And Ursula von der Leyen, she's now a nominee for NATO. Things have become very clear. Where is Europe heading to? And I think Europe is occupied. I truly believe it's occupied. I believe the Americans have a very strong grip over Europe nowadays. And if you see, what was his name? Not Julian Assange, the other guy in Moscow. He got his asylum in Moscow. I will remember his name now.
Hang on. Snowden?
Snowden, yes.
Yeah.
If you watch the documentary of Snowden, and you see how the Americans, they wired and taped entire Japan and entire Germany. The Americans can turn off the electricity in Germany. The Americans can listen to every phone call. The phone calls that we're doing now, it's been recorded by the NSA. Every text you send, every word you say is being taped by the Americans. Everything. They were spying on Angela Merkel, and they're probably doing it now on the new chancellor. So there is no independence in foreign policy here. And I don't understand, if Europe is the United States, the same, why would the Syrians open channels with the Europeans now? Unless the Europeans help themselves first and liberate themselves from the American influence. Because I remember during the day of Jacques Chirac, for example, at least there was some like freedom in their foreign policy. They opposed the Iraq war, for example. They tried to play a constructive role between Syria and Lebanon at some time. But now, when I see Olaf Scholz, Annalena Baerbock, Macron, this European Union Commission leader, I feel disgusted. Because why I feel disgusted, it's not because what they do in our countries. I feel disgusted for what they do there to their own people. And what really strikes me is the people do not really realize it, or even if they realize it, they feel powerless to do anything about it. So all these cliche that there is a democratic system here that you can change policies, it's, in my opinion, it's untrue, because after the Ukraine war, I can assure you that if we ban television in Germany, we ban television and media outlets, and ask the people if they want to be part of this war in Ukraine, the vast majority will say no. But because the government has a strong hegemonic power on the people's minds and what they have to think, which was very clear during the pandemic era, during the Corona era, and now during the Ukraine war, they are able to shape public opinion. Very capable. And because they have created this tribalism, I would say, in Western Europe and in the United States, that people identify themselves as part of a clan. Like, I'm part of the LGBTQ community. I'm an ally for the LGBTQ community. I'm part of the Black community. I'm part of the Hispanic community. They created these vertical lines in these countries in order for them to be easy to control the minds of the people. Now, imagine when the European Union comes and tells the Europeans that we're fighting for European values, which include the LGBTQ rights. So everyone in the LGBTQ community and those who consider themselves allies, they will be with Ukraine regardless of the geopolitical aspect of this war. So they made politics a mockery. They simplify things like they are teaching people like 3 years old. They're treating people like they are kindergarten,
Yeah.
and they're programming them in a way that things are white and black, a dictator against Western values. So people do really believe that, but there was a work behind that for a decade or two. They worked on this. They made people become very propagandized that you can see zombies walking in the street. And we have seen this during the Corona era when people were like actively angry all the time, yelling at each other for those who are not wearing a mask, policing the society. But
Yeah.
this was all on purpose. They made the people the police of the people who disagree with the government, right? So you
Yeah.
have now a social police in the society itself. If a German, and because I have a dog, and you know that I work with the dog, and I meet people. Sometimes I meet Russians, sometimes I meet Ukrainians, and sometimes Germans who want to talk politics. But when it comes to Ukraine, and I know when someone is with or against from the tone, and you feel like they want to talk they don't want to talk loud. They're afraid that somebody would hear them if they say what they say in the media is not really correct. And I have met a few Ukrainian refugees here, and they were saying, no, we don't consider this we don't accept the narrative of the Western mainstream media, but the people are afraid to talk. They're talking very, very, very low volume with each other because they're afraid. And
Yeah.
people need to understand you could lose your job, you could
Yeah.
lose your refugee status, you could lose your everything here if you speak up and challenge the mainstream narrative.
Well, yeah, I mean, Europe, if you look across the board, almost apart from those countries that are remaining, let's say, neutral or even loyal in the case of the people of Serbia towards Russia. But you look at the protests in France, I mean, you know, Europe is descending into one, it's committing suicide
Yes.
for the United States in Ukraine. And it's descending in at least into totalitarianism, if not into outright fascism. And that, as you said, began during the COVID project, and Ukraine has just sort of ramped it up to quite, well, I won't say unprecedented, but to historical levels. And you mentioned, I mean, you mentioned LGBTQ, etc., and how these movements are being used to effectively divide people into these vertical lines, which means very similar, I guess, to the sectarian projects that they tried to foment in Syria, even, you know, where people are fighting amongst themselves. So the West actually basically doesn't have to do anything, right? And what I'm seeing, for example, in northwest Syria is this. It appears almost like a desperation. They're pouring money into northwest Syria, into their asset on the ground, which of course is Abu Muhammad Jolani and HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was previously, well, it's Al-Qaeda basically. They're doubling down on the narratives like the chemical weapons. They're absolutely blanking out the corruption of the OPCW, the dissident inspectors, evidence, etc., etc. And today I sent you, and I would love your comment on it, the latest publication from Atlantic Council, that the earthquake in Syria and Turkey impacted everyone from refugees to LGBTQ people. And I mean, it's almost like, where do we go now, right? How do we further criminalize a Syrian government, which is clearly normalizing relations, even with former enemies that were former vassal states of the US and the UK cartel, right? And it's, to me, it appears desperate.
Yeah, I mean, if you publish, for those who don't know, there is an article in the Atlantic Council now, and they say the marginalized groups in Syria, from the LGBTQ to the trans community, etc., they are more affected, let's say, by the aftermath of the earthquake than other communities. And I would say, who is the targeted audience for this? Seriously, like, with who are they talking to? If
Yeah.
they're talking to the European Union, yeah, that means they're looking for funding for
Exactly.
the areas outside of the control of the government, because the LGBTQ community are heavily affected.
Mhm.
But the real question here is, are there LGBTQ community in the areas controlled by the opposition? Because there are definitely people who are probably gay or lesbian, and I respect everyone's sexuality. It's an individual thing. If you want to do anything you want in your bed, that's up to you. But publicly speaking, who dares in Idlib or in Afrin or Azaz
Exactly.
to say I'm gay?
Mm.
He will be stoned to death, right? So I think this is more like a preparation for these people to get probably asylum. For those who say that I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community, there could be a program in the European Union to accept them as refugees in these countries. Because in Syria, I know a friend who is gay and somebody knows someone who is lesbian. We know each other, right? But there is no active persecution against these people. And in the government-held areas, I still know that there is a bar in Damascus, and it's the government knows that the mostly homosexual people go there, and it's just a place for them to feel safe, right? So there is no active persecution or throwing them in jail or hanging them like in other countries. There is no such things in government-held areas, because you cannot stop. Like, if people think that they can stop homosexuality, they're wrong. Like, it's for thousands and thousands of years. It's there. So you have to choose your approach with them. And I truly advocate for respect for the people in their own private lives. And I'm not an advocate at all for sexualizing kids and identifying yourself. It's like it has become a national identity, you know? It's like, what is your gender? What is your sexuality? Who cares what you do in your private life? Or how
Yeah.
do you identify yourself? But this tribalism, it serves the goal, and which is dividing the country on vertical levels and creating different groups and then absorbing these groups into your own project. So now I would ask myself the question, why this article 2 months after the earthquake? Didn't he know that this community probably also affected by the earthquake 2 months ago? But no, right now it has a purpose, and we have to understand. We have to know. We will know the answer in a few weeks if the European Union declares that they have to evacuate the LGBTQ people from Syria or from the rebel-held areas.
Yeah.
Then we know what's the reason for that, right?
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
overall, it's silly, because when you talk about humanity and you say people in Syria are affected by the earthquake and we have to help the people, the LGBTQ community are part of the humans, part of the of the broader people, right?
Yeah.
So specifying it
Mm.
among all other factions of the Syrian community, probably they are less than 1% in the Syrian community. It doesn't make any sense. So there is a political reason behind that.
Exactly. So, finally, let's talk about what's happening really with regards to Israel and the increase, certainly last week in the attacks against Syria. The northeast, of course, which is still occupied by the United States, and they're still stealing Syrian oil and agricultural resources. The Al Tanif base, and the increase in terrorist attacks against Syrian army positions north of Aleppo. It appears to me that really you can't talk about one aspect of these attacks without considering the fact that they are coordinated
Yeah.
between the three entities.
I would say it's not a coincidence, and it happened all the time when there was an Israeli attack on certain posts in Syria, or even American attacks. Let's remember in what happened in Deir ez-Zor in, I think, 2018. Every time there is such an airstrike, the terrorists also try to attack the Syrian army posts.
Yeah.
And you cannot really tell me that it happens when it happens all the time, it's a coincidence. And we know that the Israeli side was in contact with the so-called rebels. That those were the al-Nusra, those were ISIS, and those were really radical jihadists in the south. They were in contact. They were treated in Israeli hospitals, and they received cash from the Israeli side. So there is definitely, I would say, a bridge, and they're connected with each other. Syrian opposition figures visited Israel, but the latest attacks on Syria, I think it has become, this pattern is very dangerous because Syria needs to establish deterrence against Israel. And this has gone. And also on the social level, the people are like, we may talk about it for an hour or two, and then we continue our lives. And that's dangerous because it spreads defeatism in the society, that we cannot respond to Israel somehow. But from the Damascus perspective, they don't want to give Israel the excuse to wage brutal air campaign on Syria, for example. They are in a very dire economic situation. They are barely able to open with their neighbors again. So there is a long process of that. And militarily speaking, if Israel wages an open aerial campaign on Syria, I mean, you know that, and I know that our defense systems are not the most sophisticated ones. So it's realistic, you know, not to respond in a direct way, but indirectly. Rest assured that there are so many weapons coming in Syria from Iran.
Yeah.
And it's meant for defense purposes, and those are the air defenses. So the Iranians know that Syria needs air defense systems, and they have developed, I would say, sophisticated systems. But the Iranian systems are different from the Russian ones, and those systems, they all have different codes. So the Syrian side has to develop a way to connect the air defenses together, because air defenses do not operate independently. There is a network, and they operate together. They are connected to a radar. So Syria has to engineer and develop a way to connect these two different systems together. And most importantly, Syria has to install them in the right places. And the Syrian territory is very watched all the time, 24/24, Israel is spying. And every time Syria tries to move one air defense system from one place to another, they get hit. And those are not easy to replace. People need to understand that the equipment could be replaced, although they are very, very expensive. But the people who are operating this, from the soldiers, the officers, and from the engineers, those are irreplaceable. You cannot have unlimited number of people operating these weapons, and they're getting murdered all the time. Every week somebody dies in an air defense system. And these people go to Russia for a few years, or to Iran now if they want to operate the Iranian systems, to get training. So those are very valuable people. So losing them all the time also, it's a very harsh blow for the Syrian side. And Israel, in my opinion, this is the best time for them to escalate. They are really, really cornered now. Like, we're not only talking cliches now. Netanyahu is really cornered in its domestic affairs. And nothing can stop now the turmoil in Israel, except an external security threat on Israel that can unite the Israelis again against one enemy, right?
Yeah.
So Netanyahu definitely trying to do that. The Syrians aren't going to give him that privilege to have its own way. And in any future conflict, if it's not happening between Syria and Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran, and at least have the neutral position of the Arab countries and not be on the side of Israel, then you can fight against Israel. It makes no sense to fight against Israel while knowing that, like, if there are 22 Arab countries, maybe 10 of them are normalizing now with Israel, right? And whether directly or indirectly. And now I can see, like, people in the Emirates, those who are influencers on Twitter, like, we're not asking them to be on the side of Palestine. We're asking them to be at least neutral.
Yeah.
Like, they are defending Israel. And you can see on social media platforms what they speak about this conflict. So in 1973, when the Syrians attacked Israel to liberate the Golan Heights alongside the Egyptians to liberate the Sinai, the Saudis stopped the oil production and they didn't supply the United States and the Europeans with oil. That was a weapon, right? But now, who is going to be on your side? In 2006, when Hezbollah had the fight against Israel, nobody supported Hezbollah. They were on the side of Israel. So it's difficult. If 1973 big two armies, Egyptian and Syrians, fought together, the equations have changed. Egypt is out of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Jordan is out of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, nobody supports you. Unlike Israel, Israel receives billions of dollars worth of weapons every year from the United States. We don't have that in Syria.
I think also for Syria, it needs to regain control of its resources. You know, if there is to be any kind of escalation between Syria and Israel, then first of all, the U.S. occupation has to be ended, and Syria has to get control of the oil. It can't be dependent in a war situation or an escalation situation on the countries that have been helping the civilian population with which is deprived entirely of its own energy resources.
Definitely. I will just mention two things here, Vanessa. One, your most oil resources is not in your hands. So imagine how can you operate an entire army in an all-out war? Right?
Exactly.
Two, a ton of border crossing that is occupied by the US. They installed their jamming technology. So at some time when the Israelis or the Americans bomb in Al-Kamal, they use this technology and the Syrian radars get blinded. They don't see what's happening. So Syria cannot really fight against Israel right now, although it is legitimate for Syria to liberate its Golan Heights or at least respond to the attacks, right? But it's not. I would be very honest. Syria is not in the position to respond now to Israel.
Exactly. I mean, we're talking about a lot of really positive changes in Syria, but nothing so far is really translating onto the ground here. You know, people are still suffering without electricity, without fuel, increasing food and energy prices. Very little is trickling down so far from these negotiations that are going on at a very high level. How do you see that changing, and do you have a view of when things might start to improve, albeit slowly? I mean, you mentioned sanctions, and of course Mark Rubio made the comment that very soon, you know, sanctions are going to be utterly pointless because people are going to be trading in currencies that are not related to the dollar. And so therefore that removes the ability for the US to carry out this economic siege warfare against countries. But, you know, short term, long term, how do you see these positive events at a diplomatic, political level actually translating to an improvement in the living conditions in Syria?
So there was the phase of hostilities against Syria 2011, 2018. 2018, now 2023, this was the negotiation and reconciliation with the region. And I believe it will take another 3 to 5 years to recover. And things really, it's very slow. And it's a very unfortunate thing to say, but the Syrians also make things very complicated for themselves a lot of times in Syria. So things are very slow. I believe a deal with Saudi Arabia and Turkey is very, very important, and it has to be done. And after that, when you get along with these countries again, there should be a conference for the reconstruction of Syria, and I think that will be headed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. First, to invite the refugees from Lebanon to Syria and to give them some economic help so that these people can come to their country back. That's the priority in Lebanon. And secondly is the change in the international structure, which is what's happening now in Ukraine. From the Syrian side, they see things on a strategic level. They see things are changing broadly and slowly in their favor, but our faith has become a hostage to this change, right? Like we cannot change this in Syria from the Syrians cannot change that now because it has become an arena for international conflict in Syria. So the international power structures have to change so that situation changes in Syria. The deal with Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and I would say 3 years maximum, the economy will revive in Syria and it will start reconstructing. Once the reconstruction starts, there will be money flown into Syria and been transferred into Syria, and that's very possible, I would say, only if the Syrians agree with the Saudis and with the Turks and open the borders with the rest. When they agree with Turkey and Saudi Arabia, I think the Americans will be very isolated. In the East, they will have the access, of course, of the oil, but for how long Americans can tolerate now? The entire region has become on good terms, and them the only ones being like an island in Syria, surrounded by countries who are not welcoming the Americans in the region. And I think on a long term, they don't have a future. And this was very clear also by the former ambassador or the envoy, American envoy to Syria. What was his name? Robert
Ford. Yeah.
Robert Ford. Like they don't have a future in Syria. He knows it. The American administration knows it, and it's just a matter of how will they withdraw from Syria and what's the fate of the Kurdish militias who have relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So probably the Saudis and the Emirates could mediate on the side of also Russia. If the Kurdish militias want to join the Syrian army, I think that's not a taboo for the Syrian army. They could get their cultural rights, which is teaching Kurdish in their schools, speaking Kurdish in their communities, and joining the Syrian army. That would be a fair, in my opinion, compromise with them.
Yeah. And as President Assad said in a meeting with the US peace delegation that I was part of in 2016, the Americans are so far up the lie tree that we have to give them, in other words, a way to get down that is not going to completely humiliate them.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
you know, I think back then...
I don't think the Syrians are interested to humiliate the Americans. They want to give them an exit.
Yeah.
And the exit would be a victory for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kevork, thank you so much for clarifying so many things for people and for, you know, your in-depth knowledge about what is going on in this country. And let's really hope, I mean, you know, events have moved so fast. Let's really hope strongly that things can equally move quite fast towards resolution with Turkey and greater collaboration with Saudi Arabia, and that Syria can start to rebuild sooner rather than later, and, you know, provide
Inshallah.
an environment for the people which is gives them a hope in the future. That's the most important thing for them now.
Yes.
So thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Vanessa.
Speak to you again very soon.
See you soon.